It's Veterans Week in Canada, and we're here to honor those who sacrificed to serve. We're here to honor those who fought in wars for decades and decades and who continue to do so today, including our honored Canadian peacekeepers. I'm Lisa Hartford, Communications Director at CanAge, and I'm here today with William Morgan, retired Army veteran. Welcome. Tell us about your life before joining the Army in England.
Well, obviously I was born in 1925 in a small town in the northeast of England called Consett, and it was noted for its massive ironworks. It was blaring day and night. Middle of the night, you would see it blaring when it cast its the steel down the mountainside. However, I went to school in Consett, and when I was 16, I enrolled in university at King's College in the School of Architecture in Newcastle. And that was about an hour's drive away. And I lasted driving away for about an hour. And then I figured by the time I was 17, I was grown up and I had my own time. Spent a number of nights fire watching because we were then 41, 42. We never got a lot of air because we were in the north of England. But we got paid 4 shillings an evening, and we got a supper and a breakfast. So it was a profitable little business for us.
Wow.
But in university, about two and a half years, in about 1943, we were getting very itchy about the war. We were in what they call the University OTC. We were in the immature uniforms. We did a lot of training as kids. However, we felt the war might be ending before we got a chance to get in. So we decided as a small little group, we went trolling around Newcastle to every recruiting office we could find. And it didn't matter what service it was, Navy, Army, or Air Force. There were 4 of us, and 3 got past medically suitable to join the Marines. And I was the one left out because I had a bent up toe. So I was classed as A2 Pete. So that kind of made me miserable. Anyway, I kept on pushing around. I had made some contacts around with the OTC and in the Army. And I finally got them to accept me into the infantry. With my foot, didn't matter.
OTC.
And,
is OTC Officer Training Center?
yes. Each university generally has a quasi-military organization, and particularly in the wartime, of course, they're pre-training you from 16 and did a lot of marching, training, exercising, use of weapons and stuff, but you weren't a soldier yet. However, in 1943, we went off and actually I went in January, February of 1944 and joined the Army, and then went in through the various levels of training.
What event, Bill, compelled you to enlist?
You're in the north of England, you really didn't get a sense of war because even air raids were very sparse. Most of the action took place in the south of England and in France. And so it felt far away. When Dunkirk happened, when the troops came back out of Dunkirk, there were, 350 odd thousand came out of there. And the minute they landed on the English soil, they were put into trains, buses, anything that would move them. And they were shipped right out into the country, right up into the northern area of the country to get the crowds of soldiers and military away from the southern end, which was the active end for war. And I think at that point in time, you suddenly realize, yes, there is a war on, and we've got to get into it. And that's primarily what it was, more just an awareness, because you saw soldiers who were in, very weak state, or no weapons, no uniforms hardly. Just as they landed on the south coast, they were whipped up to various places. And of course, it was getting into reasonable weather. So everybody was lying around in gardens and heaven knows where. They were all over the place. So that was the move. Yes, yes.
So that moment in time for you, was that a terrifying time, or as a young man about to serve his country, was that a happy, exciting time?
Oh, I think you were so excited to get into the army properly. You couldn't call it really a happy time,
No.
but you were certainly pleased that you were in. You were winning with the rest. And as I say, you were just old enough to get in. So age wasn't wasn't out of the question. And so we got in at when we were in 44, which would have put me in, I was 19 at the time. And we'd had the experience, of course, with the OTC. So we got in fairly fit and fairly ready to go.
Were you married at the time?
Yes, when I left, I was married. We were, with Jeannie, we were engaged in the New Year's Eve in 1944. We decided to get engaged. I was a little hesitant about getting married because I was going to get called off anytime after that. However, Jeannie felt that was her feeling. She said, no, let's go with it. So
Let's do it.
we got married, and it wasn't in a church, and it wasn't a big wedding. It was a licensed wedding, but legal.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a short 3-day honeymoon in Edinburgh.
Hello.
Right after the wedding. And within about a week of our honeymoon, I got the call that we were to get on the train and off to Europe.
Was it difficult to leave a young bride at home?
Oh, yes, very, very. Oh. It's not something that you thought about before, because you were thinking you're just going to go. Mm-hmm. Then the minute you realized it was serious. And I don't know, they kind of set it up right, because the train came down from the Scottish border down to Newcastle. And just on the way before Newcastle, it stopped at a little station, 10 o'clock at night, absolutely gloomy, and about a dozen different couples were there, because this train was picking them up as it worked its way down to the south of England. So it couldn't have been a more romantic or frightening setting, but it happened anyway. And then, of course, the communication. It wasn't a question of when you got there, you phoned and said, I'm here. I don't think we spoke for probably almost 6 months.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So what you had, you got a little card, and on it had sort of 3 phrases. One of them was, I'm fine, thank you. I'm safe, thank you. And you could address those to your wife or your family or whatever. But that was it. There were no telephone calls.
And I bet that many people today don't know that you couldn't freely express in a letter where you were geographically or what you
No,
were. No, right?
you couldn't.
They,
No,
it was too risky for your
that's
safety.
yes, yes. Why? I don't know. It didn't really matter that much, but when you think about it afterwards, but that was the way. I mean, there were certain circumstances, you wouldn't want mail to be saying we were in wherever, North Africa or wherever. Yeah.
So when you first arrived in Europe with the army, you were in a number of battles, and I can't imagine what that was like. Of course, I can't. What was that experience like for you? It's your first time in the army. You're away from home. You're away from your young bride, and you're fighting. What's that like?
Well, I think that the thing you thought about most, and it was part of the training. You were a platoon commander. Now, a platoon was anything up to about 30 soldiers.
Mm,
You had a couple of more senior NCOs, but most of them were private soldiers. And they were all young kids, even though I was only 19, 20. They felt like children. And you kind of realized that you were responsible for 30 people. And whatever decision you came to, or whatever plan you proposed, those 30 people were going to have to follow.
that's profound. That's a lot of
And
responsibility.
you spent more time thinking that way
Okay.
than you kind of worrying about it.
Okay.
And
Now,
as the days went by, you got more and more and more used to it. And
yeah.
so,
So our audience might not know what NCO is. I do. It's
oh,
non-commissioned
it's a
officer.
non-commissioned officer.
That's right. So
Called
tell us about what those people, what role they had,
what?
what role they had.
Well, the platoon was divided into three sections. So a corporal would be a commander of the section, and that would be about eight soldiers. A sergeant would be like the deputy to yourself. You'd have an officer, and a sergeant would be a platoon assistant platoon commander, and then you had probably three corporals that would be the three sections.
Mhm.
So that was the way that was split up. And but as I say, you got used to that very quickly, very quickly, very quickly.
Right. So when the war ended, you were in Germany still. Was that a joyous
Mm.
time, or were you just relieved and ready to get home?
You were relieved in some ways, but again, uh, just the circumstances. But during the war time, you never heard too much about camps, labor camps, uh, sort of foreign camps. People were dying. You never heard that. You see, Joan, you in Europe
Hmm.
until later, and it just so happened that actually the day war was declared as over, the fighting was to cease, didn't necessarily cease on that day. There were always people who were hanging around with loose weapons that for a few days, didn't go to everybody.
Right.
But it was a labor camp. It was a little place called Delmenhorst. It was up beside Hamburg, up in that area
In Germany. Okay.
uh, in Germany.
Hmm.
And that was a labor camp, a forced labor camp. People who'd been moved from mainly Soviet Union back into France under the German rule and working in all sorts of unpleasant surroundings. There were prisoners, and there were also a number of prisoners of war
Right.
in that camp.
Hmm.
And the joy of it was to see them being relieved. I mean, they were just, I mean, the camp would, the people who guarded the camp had disappeared.
Right.
And these
Right.
people were now roaming around the countryside. They were the ones that were happy.
Yes.
Uh,
Same.
we were just, you know, pleased, little better.
Right.
So that was the joy, if you want to call it that. But and
Still,
then, as the days wore on, you began to sort of think, well, this is great for everybody except the German people or Germans. So,
right, right. Under what circumstances were you then transferred to Italy?
well, Italy, the purpose of Italy was to establish Trieste, which was located right at the top of the Adriatic, right between Yugoslavia and Italy. And Yugoslavia had occupied Trieste
Mhm.
uh, during the war, and of course the Italians lost the war. So then the argument became a sort of world argument after the war, and this was 1945, and the United Nations was involved. And
Right.
the United Nations Security Council determined that they would have to step into this situation because it could be very serious, and was, because Trieste is really the gateway to Europe from the south. And so they put together an American, a French, and a British organization, which would probably be a brigade of people, which would be like three battalions. And they put them into Trieste to sort of keep the peace, to hold the peace.
I see.
And while the UN resolved what was going to happen. And they had established a line, a demarcation line around the area of Trieste, and they called it the Morgan line, but it had nothing to do with me. It was named after a prior General Morgan. But anyway, there was this Morgan line, which, as troops, we were patrolling, we were securing this line. It'd be about 30 or 40 miles around the area of Trieste. And that's why we were in Trieste. And yet the most amazing thing about it is that that was also the time that they brought the families out, the British families out. And that's when my wife came out to Italy.
How
But that
long?
was the reason why we went. We were just picked as the regiment that would go down and work in this security. But it didn't amount to a lot. It was resolved politically and through the United Nations. But it was about the earliest action the UN had, I think.
It sounds like
Back
early
then.
peacekeeping mission.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's what it was. Yeah,
Now,
it was the first one I'd heard of. Yes, yeah.
so around this time, I believe you and your wife came to Canada. What made you have such a big change right after the war?
Well, we won the war. We had lived in Italy, Germany, and seen the improvement that happened in the 46, 47 era, and sort of coming back to England after, it was like living on a cruise almost. I mean, we were accommodated at the most comfortable, fancy. In Venice, we stayed at the Danieli Hotel, and the Danieli Hotel
Yeah.
is the hotel of that part of Europe. And the old staff was still there, bench shoulders and what have you, because everything in that hotel was just an antique,
Mhm.
including the staff. But and the same in Trieste. I mean, we lived in a beautiful hotel right on the seafront. And of course, it was taken over by the military. And so that's where you were accommodated.
Mhm.
Um, and you come back to England after that. And I guess it just struck us that this is not a very happy place. I mean, we were struggling in England for the first 3 years after the war. It was just
Right.
miserable. The rationing was still on.
Yeah.
So I was now in looking for my fourth year of architecture because I'd finished when we came back to England. We spent a year, and I took my third year again because I'd only got halfway through it before I left. So that was fine. But as I say, that was the point where we thought, could we not move out of the country? And we looked at Australia, we looked at South Africa, and we looked at Canada. And Canada was the only place that had a fourth year, and that was out in UBC in Vancouver. So we applied there. British government were going to pay for your education after the war. That was one thing they did. And so they said, certainly, if you want to go to Canada, we'll pay the same as if you were staying in England. So they paid for us to go in fact. And we left on a little cargo, 12-passenger vessel in September. And it took us 19 days to get to Montreal because we went around the north coast of Britain and across the North Atlantic and up to St. Lawrence and got to Montreal. And then what we hadn't realized, there were another 4 days and 5 nights to get to Vancouver on the train. So a little short of money on that train. Anyway, that's what took us there.
I have a couple quick questions for you before we end. I know that you served in Ottawa as well, and I'm curious as to whether you ever went to the Diefenbunker. I might be off a few years here.
Well, the Diefenbunker was a cop.
That's right.
Not far from here, but no, I know it was there, but we were back in Europe after again. We went back to Europe in 1951. We went back to France. That was when the Cold War was on, and I had joined the RCAF after I graduated. And we went back to Paris, lived for a year in Paris, had our third child in Paris, and then we went to England for 4 years. And because of the Cold War and the building of the airfields and that Canadian, at that time, I don't think many people remember, but that time, Canada had 4 fighter wings in Europe. And that was something like 30, 40 planes in each wing. So they had about 150 fighter planes and crews and stuff in Germany. Well, they were in France, 2 in France, 2 in Germany, but then de Gaulle decided to cancel the ones in France. So we ended up with 2 in a headquarters in Germany. But it was a big effort for Canada. When now, I know that they've got 1 fighter wing. When I look back on my experience, I got the feeling that I did not restrict myself to the normal pattern of being an architect. You know, when you're training to be an architect, you think, oh, well, I'll get a chance. I'll get on the drawing board. I'll design a house or a building or what have you, and that's what I'll do. But I didn't do very many because I found myself doing things, working with these airfields, what have you. I worked in Ottawa when I came back. I worked with Strategic Air Command, the US, because they were building refueling bases in Canada. So somebody had to be representing Canada to these USAF crews as headquarters that were building them. They were funding them. We had to have Canadian people build them. So I was involved in that for several years. so I felt what I was quite happy to take on something else that, mind you, they had buildings like Frobisher Bay. We built a refueling base. So we probably built the biggest building in the Arctic because all the Americans stayed under one roof. They had the biggest building, all on piles, and still there in Frobisher Bay. All their military supporting stuff, where these planes would come in full of fuel or getting fuel. And that's where they sheltered. They were up there for 6 months at a time, and then they got shipped out. So I felt I was doing a lot of other things. Then the same when I went to Yellowknife. It was architectural in a way, but it was everything to do with buildings and roads, ferries, bridges, everything.
Nice.
So that's what I felt. Sorry.
Did you have one favorite place that you've ever lived of all the cities you've been to?
Oh, Italy, definitely. It was a country probably because we had the best time in Italy. But I liked the Italian people. I liked their sense of humor. And people generally, they're somewhat similar. And I don't know whether, because I'm from Newcastle, and that's the Geordie, as I said before, but whether they had a Geordie sense of humor or not, I don't know. But no, I would have been very happy to have settled in Italy. Yeah.
Nice. Bill, do you have any regrets about having enlisted all those years ago?
No, definitely not. I learned a lot, and I realized that at the time I realized it when we came back from being in Europe. It was 1947, and that's when I took my third year again. Now, I had gone to university first year when I was 16. Now I'm coming back and I'm 23, 22. I got three children. And I suddenly realized what a little twerp I was when I went to university at 16, because I spent more time playing around than I did studying architecture. I mean, we were kids.
I have the same thoughts.
Yep. Yeah. But you go back and you suddenly realize that everybody else in the class is about 5 or 6 years younger than you.
That's
you
right.
see, they're twerps, But when I came to Canada, there were a lot of well, I say a lot. There were only 5, 6 in our graduating class. And that's why I came to Canada, because I got my fourth year and I got my 5th year. And that was the first graduating year at UBC for architecture.
Okay.
So that's why double whammy, I got benefit being among the first who graduated in architecture. 5 of us actually graduated.
Well, we're running out of time for this recording, and I want to get a moment in to thank you so much for volunteering your time today to help us understand what war was like and subsequent life after the war in your eyes. Bill Morgan, thank you from CanAge and our audience.